Canada found themselves far from home, farmed out as workers or servants. We'll hear from a genealogy expert about that little-known part of Canadian history. Well, next week, author and genealogy expert Lori Oschefski will be in Winnipeg at the Millennium Library to talk about some mid-19th to mid-20th century history that we don't hear much about. 1867 to 1949, nearly 120,000 children were shipped across the sea without their parents. These were the British home children who were brought over to work on farms or as servants once they arrived here. Many Canadians are descended from these children, though they may not have a clue about it. Lori Oschefski's presentation is called Breaking the Silence, and she joins me from her home in Barrie, Ontario. Good morning.
Good morning.
Lori, tell me, who were the British home children?
The British home children were approximately 100,000 children that were immigrated from the United Kingdom to Canada to be used as indentured servants or domestics in our farms and in our households. I think most people confuse the home children with the guest children, and the guest children were children who came over during the Second World War to protect them against the ravages of the war in England. But I think the primary difference is that the British home children were sent here to Canada to work, and there was never any intentions to send them back home.
So were they in care or were they orphans?
The only 2% of the children that came over were in fact true orphans by today's standards. In the beginning, in 1863, they obviously had problems with Victorian England and poverty in the streets and that kind of thing going on over in England. And this is where the British home children migration began, its roots in that. About 1891, Canada didn't want children being brought into Canada here, and the programs kind of shifted, and the vast majority of children in the following years came from what in our society today would be our welfare children, children in need.
And how old?
Well, they came to Canada anywhere from infants up to 18 years of age. I mean, at one point they were even bringing babies into Canada. Now, that didn't last very long because the children weren't doing too well with the climate over here, so they stopped that. But I've had children that were as young as 2 that were brought over here.
And what was the setup, that the idea that Canada needed agricultural workers and domestic servants, and they had some arrangement with Britain?
Britain had problems with too many children in need over there. They didn't have any social systems set in place like we do today to deal with families in need. So what they did is they built institutions, basically, and the parents were encouraged to admit their kids into these institutions. But what they didn't tell them was as soon as they did that, they forfeited their parental rights. And therefore, these organizations have the right to immigrate their child out of the country without any further notice to the parent.
And what would that journey have been like? They would take many children at a time under supervision on ships? They
would have supervision on the ships. There would be employees of the different and various organizations that would come across to Canada with them. So they would be brought over anywhere in small parties from, maybe 5 children up to larger parties of over 300 children at a time.
And what would they have with them? What would they bring?
They would be furnished with a small trunk, and they would have just your basic clothing, shirts and pants and shoes and different things that they would need on the farm. Unfortunately, they weren't equipped to handle the cold and the variation in climate that we have here in Canada. That type of thing became an issue for the home children.
Because they weren't properly dressed by the people they were living with?
Dressed. Yeah.
So did the people that they were sent to have no responsibility?
No, they signed a contract saying that they would school the child and they would feed the child and that kind of thing. But any of the provisions that the children needed, they'd have to go back to the organizations who oversaw the care of those kids.
These children were, in many cases, literally farmed out. And were these people who wanted them, or were some of them accepted as children?
The vast majority of them were wanted as workers, and they weren't accepted into the families. A lot of them were made to sleep in barns or in old attics and that kind of thing. But no, having said that, there was a lot of children that were accepted into the families and were adopted. Now, in 1922, I know in Ontario, there wasn't any legal adoption done, so back in those days, adopted just meant that you brought them into the family and treated them as one of your own.
And what happened to most of these children when you say they were indentured till they were adults, or could they leave after?
The boys were indentured until they were 18 years of age, and the girls were indentured until they were 21. Most of these children didn't receive the schooling that was promised, or, so they didn't receive an education. And the only job that they knew was working as laborers on the farm. So, even though the terms of their indenture was released at the age of 18, they were supposed to receive payment from the organizations, not the farmers. The organizations were supposed to pay the children. Now, if they got paid or not, that's another question. So a lot of them were released from their indentures, and they really had no place to go.
They were ill-equipped to go out into the world.
Very ill-equipped. And really what really impacted these children the most is that they weren't only ill-equipped for society and for the work world. They were also ill-equipped to handle families because they were not raised in family. They were not loved. They were not given affection. They didn't know how to behave as part of a family member. So when most of the home children grew up and eventually married and had children of their own, they had a lot of difficulties dealing with families. They became very distant and, in some cases even abusive to their own families. And in other cases, they were the complete opposite. They became the most loving and most generous type of parent. So,
do you see any parallels with the Indian residential schools that were set up in Canada where children were traumatized and then raised outside a family setting?
Absolutely. I think it absolutely parallels the natives and the experience that they had in the residential schools. There are no words to draw comparisons between the two because I think, both are equally as brutal. What
response have you had from former home children, or I suppose their descendants now?
We've actually had the pleasure or the honor of interviewing several surviving British home children, and I think basically what their response to it is that they were worked very hard and they weren't treated very well, and they all suffered from the stigmatization that was placed on British home children here in Canada. But a lot of these home children were able to overcome those things and were able to go on and make productive lives and do good in this country.
Well, thank you very much for shedding a little light into what is quite a dark corner of our history.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Lori Oschefski will present her free talk, Breaking the Silence, on Thursday evening, August 4th, in the Carol Shields Auditorium at the Millennium Library downtown. You're listening to